Hey, I'm Osman Faruqi, and this is The Drop, a weekly culture show from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, where we dive into the latest in the world of pop culture and entertainment. I'm here with Thomas Mitchell and Meg Watson. How you guys doing?
Hey, I'm good. I'm happy to be here. I'm sorry to say that I'm not the book person in Mel's absence.
Yeah, it's very exciting to have you, Meg, but it is a very unfortunate episode for Mel to be missing. She is sadly a bit unwell, but it's devastating timing considering that the focus of today's episode is the movie adaptation of one of the best-selling books of all time, Colleen Hoover's It Ends With Us, starring Blake Lively. But, you know, we can hold it down. I don't actually know if this is one of Mel's, favorite books. Do you have any insight into that, Thomas?
I can't imagine if she's coho? What do they call themselves, the fans? I can't imagine if she's a big Hoover head. But, you know, she has just good takes on most things book-related. So we do miss her, but we shall persevere.
We'll persevere. Look, the film, the book, subject of much controversy, and there's a lot of behind-the-scenes drama that we're going to get into as well. But how are you doing over there, Thomas? How are things?
Yeah, not too bad. Just, dealing with the first confirmed case of hand, foot and mouth in our household. My child is at daycare, and it's one of the big, big three, I guess, alongside gastro and knits. I can only assume that Mel also has hand, foot and mouth. That's why she's not here.
Did she give it to your child?
Yeah, no, I don't know. But it's just, I don't know. There's just too many words in that disease. It's you don't want three different things going on.
Well, okay, this is a thing about this disease that has always confused me, right? Because you've heard about foot and mouth disease, which is something that cows get and then they kill them by the millions. And so when I first heard of hand, foot and mouth disease, I was like, well, that's even worse because now a hand is involved. But apparently they don't just euthanize children.
No, there's not a secret slaughtering of millions of toddlers. To be honest, I've thought about slaughtering them a few times over the last 24 hours because it's pretty annoying. But
oh no! And can you get it as well? Can adults get it?
Well, no. This is the thing. Most people had it when we were younger and stuff, so it's not really very contagious. So I can assure you all, even though you guys are in Melbourne and I'm in Sydney, my hand, feet, and mouth are completely clean.
I'm making a little cameo here today as well because when I went to drop my 1-year-old daughter at daycare this morning, I had her in the carrier and she was coughing and threw up all over me. So
wow.
I'm in the office for a bit and then straight back home for sick girl duty.
Parenting, what a life.
I recommend it. It's great.
Yeah.
It's really fun.
This is the first time I've been, not the first time, but I feel very outnumbered now all of a sudden. You guys doing your bit for the future of humanity.
That must be hard for you, all the free time and money.
All right, so as well as discussing all of the It Ends With Us drama and the movie itself, we're also going to talk about the return of Industry, one of my favorite TV shows for the past couple of years. It's a show that has steadily been growing in popularity, and I think there's a couple of star-studded additions to the cast this season. It's got the famed Sunday night HBO time slot replacing House of the Dragon. So I think the show is ready to really get into the mainstream. But before we get to that stuff, the Olympics, guys, they're finally over. How are you feeling? You happy, sad, relieved, missing it?
I think I'm missing it a little bit, yeah. I feel like the closing ceremony almost got me too hyped that it was it's sad that this is now over. Bringing out Tom Cruise, I think we all love Tom Cruise and having him on a motorbike in Paris, it feels 4 years now, feels too long. And I also think, very funny to include Dre and Snoop. When you really think about their backstory, it's very funny that they're the face of the LA Games.
It's crazy. It's crazy that they're the mascots of this city when they first burst onto the scene and it was NWA and stuff. It was shut these guys down, send them to jail.
Yeah, it's a real full circle moment. But yeah, I'm very hyped, but I am sad that it's gone. And
so do you reckon we'll see 1-4 doing the handover from London to Brisbane or something like that?
Sadly, I just still think it'll be Shepherd.
Maybe it'll be Savage Garden. Jacob Elordi, he's a Brisbane boy,
Actually,
right?
they're actually Brisbane acts. 1-4 is not a Brisbane act. I didn't really think that one through. How about you? How about you, Meg? I actually don't know what your sort of general engagement with the Olympics was the last couple of weeks.
Pretty high. Yeah, I'm really sad to see it go because it's just that perfect, collective, easy experience. You guys talked about it on the pod before. It's just you get home from work and you're just staying in and everyone's watching the Boulder and lead at 8 p.m. or whatever. What a dream. You don't have to think about what to do. But then it's also kind of nice. It's got to a point where it's what film and TV is going on? I've kind of lost touch.
Yeah, it's nice. It's nice that Industry waited for the Olympics to finish before starting. But yeah, I mentioned it on the pod last week, but it what really made me so happy about the last few weeks was every single person, it seemed like, was across the same couple of things, whether it was like, the French pole vaulter who we talked about, or the Turkish shooter, or Australia winning gold and the Fox sisters, and perhaps none more than the Raygun stuff that happened over
What a
the
way to
weekend.
go out. Oh my God.
Look, it's not even been a week since that dance really took over the world. Like, that went properly viral in a way that few things have in a very, very long time. But in the last 5 or 6 days, we've been through, not even 4 or 5 days, been through so many levels of the discourse cycle on it. Part of me is exhausted about thinking about Raygun, but this is our first time together, the three of us, to talk about this. And there is so much misinformation about it, so many theories and rumors. We've done some really great stories. One of our reporters, Francis Howe, has done a really good, basically, explainer of how Rachel Gunn made it to the Paris Olympics as a breaker, what the process was like in Australia, how people within the breaking community feel. There's a couple of bits to unpack there, but kind of initial takes, folks. What were your reactions to seeing Australia's women's breaking entry last weekend?
I mean, the joy that I felt on Saturday morning was pretty unmatched. Just seeing those first clips roll through. It's so rare that you see something like that, right? In what other sport in the Olympics could you see someone who's, average to good, and just that harsh comparison? I actually I saw the clips online and they're just hilarious. And so I immediately went and watched the whole competition because I was like, there's no way this is fair. It's probably just one weird little thing. Yeah. I highly recommend the full watch. But yeah, I mean, my first take was that it's so funny and very confusing, and you wanted to know that backstory. But then there is kind of a sadness about it as well, because you think, who else could have taken that spot? How does it affect the Australian breaking community? And I mean, it's kind of Australia as a whole is reflected in this, right? Rachel Dratch is playing Raygun on The Tonight Show in the Australian trackie uniform.
That was crazy to see.
Australian dagginess is on full display, and that's very funny, but it's also, I mean, not the point of the Olympics, right? Yeah.
Was there any part of you, Thomas, that felt sort of disrespected that this is what Australia was doing on the international stage in this sport?
Yeah, it was weird. I think you're right in that it's kind of evolved through so many different discourse cycles already. My initial thing was it's kind of funny, but surely if I go down to fucking time zone, there's 10 better breakdancers there. I could just round them up and take them to the Olympics. And then I thought what was quite funny though was that at first everyone was this is a funny meme. There was maybe a little bit of an attitude of we've done, it's been our greatest Olympics ever. We've won more medals in Paris than we did in Athens 2004, and yet the kind of lasting memory of Australia will be Raygun's maybe not so great technical performance. But at first I felt everyone was kind of down to almost, I don't know, embrace the Kath and Kimness of it all. And then once it became an international thing, it's almost our protective Australianness kicked in, and we're okay, it's only okay for us to make fun of her. And now that you guys are making fun of her, that's not cool anymore. So it's been almost interesting to watch as an Australian identity exercise. I have kind of flip-flopped so much on what I think is the right thing. And you mentioned our colleague Francis' story, definitely worth a read, because that gave me a lot of context. And I think I basically feel now we just don't have many good breakdancers in Australia, especially the women's community of breakers is very small. She kind of, legitimately won her way there. This might sound really slack. I'm probably going to make an enemy of the, tens of people that do breaking in this country. But she is perhaps the best of a bad bunch. I don't think we perform well at the World Championships historically. So I don't know. It's sad that there is really good breakers out there that aren't part of the correct avenues to get to places like the Olympics. But I think the discourse of her being this is a white privilege thing and she's just, cheated her way there are probably unfair, even though I understand the frustration that, to go to the Olympics and put on a performance that is kind of embarrassing and perhaps technically not up to scratch is also very frustrating.
It's definitely not true she cheated her way there. We should say that. She definitely went through the qualification processes. But I think it's still a failure of the systemic system in place in breaking, which is, a relatively new sport, if we're going to call it a sport. And there's a lot of contention about whether it should be in the Olympics at all. And I think it's not fair to say that Rachel Gunn, it's her fault that she's the representative and it's taking away the opportunity from someone else. But I think it's probably fair to say that of the system which sends people through, why weren't there more scouts picking up people at time zone? I mean, if you're a 16-year-old breaker from like Western Sydney, are you going to even know that there is a pathway? The person with a PhD in breaking is probably the person who will know.
Yeah, maybe it's worth sort of unpacking a little bit of how we ended up here, because it was, I think, to a lot of people incongruous to see Australia represented at breaking, which, you know, breaking, b-boying, b-girling, breakdancing, it's one of the 4 pillars of hip hop. You know, it has its genesis in black communities in America in the 70s and in the 80s. And in Australia, like most people, when you think about B-boys and B-girls, you think about the Filipino, Korean kids out in public places in the city, just absolutely carving it up. And then all of a sudden, it's this academic from Macquarie Uni, this 36-year-old white lady who looks like she's taking the piss in terms of her outfit, and the moves are not good. So it's like, okay, hang on, what happened here? And that's led to all these rumors. You know, there's these weird things going around on social media. There's this petition that's got thousands and thousands of signatories, suggestions that her husband was a judge and he's the one who kind of snuck her in. I think the short version of this essentially is like, yes, there's a lot of B-boys and B-girls in Australia who just participate in the sport socially and casually. This sport gets picked quite late in the piece to be a new part of the Paris Olympics. The community here scrambles to create some sort of framework and structure to decide who is selected to go to Paris. There's a handful of volunteers who put their hands up to create this process. It's not ideal. It's not perfect. There's this one event in Sydney that's the best chance to send someone along. That obviously skews it to who knows about this process, who's got the resources to get to Sydney and spend a weekend there. It potentially excludes a whole bunch of the people from Western Sydney, like you pointed out, Meg, and from all different parts of Australia who couldn't participate. And so, yeah, there's not a conspiracy. It's just a sport that's in its professional infancy that led to something that looked quite jarring. And I think it has ultimately, it's kind of unfair. Like, I've been at the center of some social media pylons, Thomas. We've discussed your recent forays in that world as well. Being the subject of global ridicule is something like quite intense. And I don't think, it doesn't matter how bad an athlete is, I don't think anyone really deserves that. I think it's also true that it looked like a lot of Australian athletes crashed out at this Olympic Games. You know, like Rowan Browning, who's apparently the fastest man in Australia, he finished 6th in his heat for the Olympics. Like, it wasn't a great run, but he just ran slightly less fast than everyone else. So no one kind of pointed at him and said, you suck, you're a bad athlete. When you're dancing, and dancing it already is this kind of subjective thing, and you look a bit weird, you're going to get piled on more in a way. So I think all of that is like very unfair, and I feel a bit sad about what happened to her. But I also feel there's a part of me that's like, you know, even though the sport's in its infancy and there wasn't a good enough process or a lot of resourcing to get them there, it did feel like depressingly Australian that breaking, when these other countries managed to find ways to send really good and interesting and diverse competitors, we just kind of didn't bother engaging with it to that extent. And it felt like a missed opportunity in terms of what Australia can offer in these things. And like you said, Meg, we'd done so well in the Olympics up until then. We had this great reputation. Everyone was like, how cool is Australia there? I became the most nationalistic I have been for, 3 years since the Tokyo Games. And then it's like, oh, cool, a daggy Australian in a, looks like a PE teacher's uniform, seemingly taking the piss out of hip hop culture. I didn't really appreciate that. And I will go as far as to say, as an Australian, I felt let down that this is the best that we could offer the world stage.
Oh, God, I can hear the Daily Mail headlines now. Yeah, it is weird. And she kind of has said quite openly that she, I think, knew, again, because of her like performance at the World Championships in Belgium, where all of the Australian dancers, I think, came last. She knew that she wasn't going to be as technically proficient as the other dancers. And so her kind of angle was to go like for originality, and that's why some of her moves were so like out there and stuff. And again, I do see why people are like, well, fuck, come on, like you can't really like go all the way to the Olympics and then just like take a gamble on doing something absolutely wacky and hope that maybe pays off. So yeah, it's very weird that this has become the enormous talking point that it has, and I guess this is the beauty of the Olympics. But yeah, I still think just like for whoever cares or what it's worth, the GOAT of the Olympics is the Turkish shooting man.
Yeah, a lot of people have compared Rachel Gunn to like Eric the Eel. Do you remember him from Sydney Olympics 2000 where he finished last and it was the first time he'd actually swum that far because the country he comes from didn't have pools. And I actually find that to be a ridiculous comparison. Like this guy went up against all the odds to make it to the Olympics and came from a very poor part of the world and struggled and managed to do it. And like that sort of narrative of overcoming all adversity and making a name for yourself, that's the magic of the Olympics. I don't know if Rachel Gunn it falls into that category. Like going to the Olympics with a lot of structural support and tanking is not an Eric the Eel situation.
I think she's a bit more of our Stephen Bradbury.
Exactly. At least he won a medal.
No, but you know what I mean? Like that's a celebration of Australian mediocrity. It was a guy who was losing and just happened to chance it. And, you know, Raygun happened to chance her way into the Olympics. And you kind of have to root for that underdog or you feel bad for them. And like, obviously it's not the same because she didn't win. But I mean, to avoid a pile-on and ruining this woman's life, you're left with little else to do other than like support her once it's done.
Yeah, I don't want to turn this into a cultural studies PhD like Rachel Gunn has.
I think the real winner at the end of the day is obviously the next season of Dancing with the Stars.
Yeah.
She will be the first person cast. And to be honest, Seven could probably use the win. It's been a big week.
She will have a long career on Australian TV.
Well, what I was going to say, and you know, maybe this is straying too far into like just social theory territory. I always find it interesting which celebrities or athletes mainstream Australia is very quick to like feel sympathy for and try to redeem, and which ones they continue to take down. I mean, you don't have to get into the specifics of this, but like Latrell Mitchell's like back in the news. This is an athlete who is like actually extremely good, but you know is also a vocal, proud black man, and the opportunities and the second chances afforded to him by powers that be seem like quite in contrast to kind of mediocre, well-meaning like white athletes. I think that's just a part of the way that, you know, Australian society has functioned and continues to function. I don't want to use Rachel Gunn as an example of everything wrong with, you know, the discussion around tall poppy syndrome in Australia, but I think it is interesting the way that the fault lines have emerged, like who is upset with her and who is willing to just say, she just gave it a go. She's a nice lady. Let's leave her alone. But I reckon we probably leave the Raygun conversation there.
I did see a friend of mine said, and I'm sure a lot of people have said the same, as succulent Chinese meal man has fallen, a new hero must rise in Australian meme culture.
Exactly. The cycle just continues.
It does feel like this will be one thing that we do talk about in like 20 or 30 years. And I like that. I think it's nice to have monoculture again for that reason. Because
she's going to write an incredible paper about this.
A couple of other quick bits of news before we get into the main focus of today's ep. Did you guys see the trailer for the new movie Saturday Night?
NBC makes more money playing runes of The Tonight Show.
NBC is lucky to have something as relevant as this show.
Lauren, they don't even want it.
That's logical, Dick. That's why they're paying us all to be here.
I mean, Lauren, 90 minutes of live television by a group of 20-year-olds who've never made anything. Do you ever stop and wonder why they said yes? A counterculture show starring total unknowns with zero narrative and even less structure. They want you to fail.
We just have to make it to air.
Am I still in the show?
I am very hyped for this. I feel like Saturday Night Live was a big thing in my house. My dad's like a big SNL guy. He's got all the books. I kind of felt like I lived through a lot of iterations of it through him. So I'm really excited about this. And also I think like, I don't know, Nicholas Braun as Jim Henson could be like one of the great casting choices. The whole thing just looks like I'm down.
He's having fun in the trailer. So quickly, this is a movie by Jason Reitman. It's based on the real life events leading up to the night of the first episode of Saturday Night Live. It's got a stacked cast. Finn Wolfhard, Nicholas Braun, you mentioned, Gabrielle LaBelle from the Steven Spielberg movie The Fabelmans, Rachel Sennett, Corey Michael Smith, Cooper Hoffman, Kai Gerber, Willem Dafoe, Matthew Rhys, J.K. Simmons, John Batiste. It's crazy. What did you think of the trailer?
I think it's really interesting. The drama in that trailer, it was like they were landing a man on the moon. And even I saw John Mulaney recently roasting it. John Mulaney, who's a longtime SNL writer and star, roasting it on Seth Meyers also SNL alum, just saying like, wow, I didn't know it was that dramatic, guys.
Yeah, the Mulaney bit was very, very funny. Even like the poster for the film is so funny. It says, the writers are inebriated, the set is on fire, the sound system is wrecked, the actors are physically assaulting each other, the crew is in open revolt, they have 90 minutes to figure it all out. Will they do it? It's like, well, we know they did it. Like Lorne Michaels, like the most successful TV producer in history.
I mean, I'm invested in the drama, and I think, you know, us and everyone who listens to this podcast probably feels the same. Even if you don't love SNL, and specifically in its current iteration, which is not the height of what it has been, it's this incredible institution, so much pop culture stuff to dive into there. Will normal people going to the cinema care? I don't know.
Yeah, if you're not in the bag
that.
for SNL, why do you care about this movie?
Yeah, it's weird. Also, I feel like that blurb could just apply to most TV shows. It could apply to this podcast. The crew is in open revolt.
Who's
the Chevy Chase of this podcast?
But yeah, I do wonder how niche it is. Like, and also especially it's such a like, you know, American product. Like, do people in the UK going to go and watch a movie about like Saturday Night Live? Will many people in Australia care enough to go and see it? But yeah, I guess we'll see.
I think it could have an incredible press run at least.
Yeah, totally.
Because they've done so much research, and like the film itself is modeled together from all these interviews with so many past cast and crew, and that's really interesting. There's so much to dive into there. Plus the people involved. I mean, why is Nicholas Braun playing two people in this
It's
film?
so weird. And
he's playing Andy Kaufman, which is like a historically very, you know, difficult role.
Yeah.
As well as Jim Henson.
Yeah.
I mean, I love the guy, but what's up?
I think the sheer amount of star power will
Yeah.
get people in. People will just be like, I kind of know that guy. I want to see him do something. The other bit of film news that caught my attention, Meg, like a long time ago, maybe like 10 years ago or more, you told me about a movie that I should watch. And that movie had a sequel that you told me I should watch. And I ended up watching those two movies, and they probably had two of my top 10 favorite movies ever made.
I changed your life.
You changed my life. You changed my life. They Mamma Mia and Mamma Mia, Here We Go Again.
Let's go.
There was an interview Christine Baranski, who is, I guess, like a sort of secondary cast member of those films, did with the Hollywood Reporter, and she was asked about the possibility of Mamma Mia 3. And she said, very excitingly, that she had lunch with Judy Kramer, one of the producers of those films, and she said that she's working on it. She's come up with a plot and that she's keen to make it happen. My favorite quote from this interview, though, was, she's talking about how this is the kind of movie we need to get people in the theaters. She said, it's the kind of movie that makes people happy. Witnessing how much people are showing up for these Democratic campaign rallies now. There's a lot of smiles and a lot of laughter. People are drawn to happiness and joy. Mamma Mia made so many millions of people around the world happy. So I don't know if she's like linking the future of this franchise to the political fortunes of Kamala Harris, but regardless, like, I'm excited if this comes back.
I love how it's like we've come up with a plot. Like, I bet you maybe it'll be in Greece. Like, maybe something will happen in Greece for Mama 3. But yeah, I will obviously go and see it. I mean, I love any movie set in Greece, and they make 3 Wog Boys. So why? I mean, if they can make 3 Wog Boys, and you know that I love Nick Giannopoulos, you know, as if he's one of those.
That's a
weird
great point.
uncles.
We can't have the Wog Boy being like the longest running franchise set in the Greek islands. You know,
No way, man. That's a crime against cinema. So yeah, I reckon I'm giving it my green light anyway.
What's your take on the Mamma Mia franchise, Thomas?
I love Mamma Mia. I'm also like, yeah, it's got everything you need. It's got like happy music, famous people in it, the Greek islands. Like, there's no way you go and watch those films and have a bad time.
I might have already said this on the podcast before, but when I watched Mamma Mia, Here We Go Again, I was struck by how the narrative structure is one for one for The Godfather 2. Like, it's exactly the same thing, and that is a sequel, but also a prequel through flashbacks, and you learn more about what made the characters act in certain ways and shape them. And I thought I was going crazy, and then I read an interview with the director, and he was like, my daughter watched The Godfather 2, and she was like, hey, you should make Mamma Mia 2, but you should make it like The Godfather, where it's a prequel and a sequel. So it's a very deliberate choice here.
That's very interesting. But on behalf of all women, I'm not going to let you hijack the Mamma Mia discussion to talk about The Godfather. That's not in the spirit of this film.
Oh, that's very funny. All right, guys, got a question for you. How familiar are each of you with the works of one Colleen Hoover?
I have heard of her.
Okay.
I have been to airports.
Yes, I too have been to airports, but I am across Colleen Hoover. I have young nieces who get very swept up in the book talk movement, I suppose. and any opportunity to mention that I once wrote a book. But at the time that my book was published, which was 2021, Book Talk was really blowing up, and my publishers kept saying to me, like, have you seen Colleen Hoover on Book Talk? Like, you should really try and like start a TikTok account and do some book talking. And so I think if you were to go and scour the internet, there is like a book talk that I started in like mid 2021, me talking shit about anyway, I didn't become Colleen Hoover.
I'm absolutely going to scour the internet to find that, my friend. That's what I'm doing immediately after this podcast recording.
Yes, but yeah, I'm across her, and she did very well, it turns out.
She did very well.
Very well for a self-published author at the start, for sure.
Yeah, so she started writing in 2011 and self-published her first few books. They got kind of really good reviews on different independent blogs and things like that. But her biggest selling book, It Ends With Us, which has sold nearly 7 million copies around, which is just, for context, an insane amount of books. Like, people don't sell that many books. I think in a couple of years, it outsold the Bible, which is, famously like the most selling book every year. That was released in 2016, but it had this big boost in 2021 during the pandemic when everyone was on Book Talk. It Ends With Us is a romance novel. It's loosely inspired by the abusive relationship between her mother and father. And if you think those two things sound like odd together, they are definitely. And it's going to be a big part of our conversation around the film adaptation. The movie is extremely successful. It's number 2 at the box office behind Deadpool and Wolverine, which gives us a sort of weird Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds synergy. I think if you said 10 years ago that those two would be the leads in the biggest 2 movies at the global box office, that would feel a bit weird. Anyway, it stars Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, who's also the director of the film. Also stars Jenny Slate and Hassan Minhaj in supporting roles. Lively's character, Lily Blossom Bloom, is a florist. The names in this movie are crazy. She is a florist, strikes up a relationship with Ryle Kincaid, who's played by Justin Baldoni. Most of the film plays out, it's kind of a straightforward romance story. They go on dates, there's some fun montages, they move in together. She works with Ryle's sister, who's played by Slate. The sister becomes her best friend. They work together in this florist. It's all kind of like nice and romantic. And while that story is developing, we also get flashbacks to younger Lily, who befriends a homeless boy named Atlas. They become close. They end up sleeping together. As the movie progresses, we end up getting some pretty heavy revelations. Turns out Lily's dad was physically abusive to both her mother and to her friend, the young Atlas. We also learn that Ryle has actually been physically abusive to Lily multiple times, something the film kind of avoids showing until quite late on. We think it's just like a nice, beautiful relationship, but it turns out that no, the movie's hidden from us some pretty intense things that have been going on between them, and that's the main tension point of the movie. Lily grapples with what to do with her relationship and her life. This was a very unusual movie. I was not familiar. I mean, I was familiar with the source material, but I hadn't read it. At times, it felt like a rom-com, particularly the early bits of their relationship, particularly every time Jenny Slate and Hassan Minhaj are in the movie. I mean, they're comedians, so you wouldn't cast them if you weren't trying to make it sort of funny and comedic. But then there is this really abrupt and unsettling tonal shift when the film starts to become about abuse and domestic violence and what to do about that. I kind of thought it was unclear what the movie's message was about some of those bigger themes. So much to talk about in terms of the movie itself, the performances, all of the drama that has been playing out during the press tour. But kind of maybe as a starting point, simple question, Meg, what did you make of It Ends With Us?
Yeah, it's a strange film. I think your perception of it probably depends on how you walk in and what information you know. I think even saying that plot summary, that's going to give people a different impression. If you didn't know there's anything about domestic violence in this film, which arguably a lot of the marketing doesn't want you to know.
Yeah, the trailers do not suggest anything of that kind.
No, in fact, one of the trailers quotes a tweet that says, bring your girlfriends, wear your florals, make it a girls' night out, which is deeply upsetting. But so, I mean, I went in with low expectations. I think I've not read the book, but I know the book's kind of notorious for being quite poorly written. As popular as it is, I think that popularity comes from the shock and melodrama of it. I mean, the TikToks you talk about were all like Gen Z women kind of crying as they were blindsided by those violent twists. So I went in with very low expectations, thought it was kind of an upgraded lifetime movie type thing. And I really found it that way for half of the film, 2/3 of the film, really cringeworthy dialogue. The romance it sets up, I mean, as a rom-com, it fails. It's not funny. There's no real tension or stakes other than will she or will she not go on a date with a hot neurosurgeon? And so it was very cringeworthy. I didn't enjoy those parts of the film. But then I think I found the last third of the movie surprisingly more compelling than I thought I would. Not so much that it redeems the entire movie for me. I wouldn't say it is great cinema, but I think it's very interesting in what it's doing. And you know, there are worse stories out there. I think there were people crying in the cinema behind us.
Yeah, our cinema was full of younger women sobbing. I found that quite perplexing. I was not at all emotionally invested in the stakes of this.
I think in those moments I was. I think the way that it does some of those violent sequences was surprisingly bracing. And I think Blake Lively, who I don't like as an actress, was really great in those moments. And the questions it raises and the dynamic it presents is compelling for a lot of women to think about, I think. And I think those women who are crying were probably having pretty compelling discussions afterwards as well.
I couldn't disagree more with most of what you said, but I want to get Thomas's take on the movie. What did you think about this one?
Yeah, once again, good to have Osman and I leading the discussion on this. Yeah, I think I watched it alone in a cinema, which just felt like such an odd thing to do for me to be just heading off to see It Ends With Us. But like, I think it's really tricky because there's so much like emotional buy-in with this movie that people have before you even walk into the cinema because like really everyone knows this story. I mean, we're probably in the minority in that the three of us saw the movie and haven't read the book. Like I would say many of the cinema goers will have been massive Hoover heads and were fully across, I've been like part of this story since 2021, you know. And so like I don't know if they care what the movie's like, and I get the feeling that the people making the movie didn't really care either. That's kind of how I felt watching it. Like they, as far as I can tell, there are a couple of changes from the book, but it's a pretty faithful adaptation. But I thought, yeah, it was like, it did really feel like a Lifetime movie. And then at the very end, like, you know, this dark stuff happens. And I wasn't sure if it was supposed to, you know, like leave us with a message about anything really.
I mean, I think there's different ways to watch it. I think if there's a message, it's dismantling some of the ideas about domestic violence in relationships. I think there's often this idea that men who hurt their partners are kind of like, there's this thing of the monster myth. It's this, you know, big bad guy who's going to come out of nowhere and smack you and he's all evil all the time. And I think this film does a good job of showing that's not the case. You know, hot neurosurgeons can also have massive anger problems and hit their partners, and those relationships can have days and times which are very good. And sometimes people stay in those relationships because they cling on to those good times, or they're gaslit into thinking the bad times were an accident or weren't what they thought it was, or a mistake that won't happen again. And I think it did show that in a compelling way. And I think the idea of whether to leave, whether you should leave, whether you're seeing a situation in the reality that you should, was done quite well. And even with the knowledge of how the movie was going to turn, because you know it's got this violent edge towards it, you can watch those kind of more Lifetime movie parts of it, picking up the little red flags in a way. And if anything, that was the tension of the earlier parts. You know, you see him, in the very first time you see him, he's like thrashing, kicking a chair. There's these violent tendencies unearthed early on. In the way that they're flirting, there's like line crossing as well. It's like, at certain points she wants to stop doing things and he kind of like flirtatiously pushes on. Those are red flags. And like watching those sequences as a woman can have a more insidious response, I suppose. So even if it's kind of boring, it's an experience of getting inside a relationship like that. I don't think it nails, like it's as a public service announcement, as a public campaign, it's not incredible, but as a talking point about domestic violence and how it actually plays out in real life, I think it's interesting and worthwhile. I think like the end is also something we can talk about, the way it kind of almost redeems him a little bit by giving him motivation almost to why he has these angry responses. He's got this childhood trauma he's kind of responding to in one way, you know, that shows that these feelings of anger and frustration come from somewhere and can be worked on by men, which is important, but in another, it gives you a bit of an out as well. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's a point, but I think it's not clear.
I think that what you just said then, that there is maybe a point it's not clear and maybe the end contradicts some of what it's trying to say. I think that's kind of more close to how I feel. And I guess I don't really disagree with a lot of what you said there, but I think it's maybe more generous. And I think someone with your knowledge, experience, engagement with culture and conversations around this, you can fill in some of the blanks around, you know, is the film trying to suggest that she should have recognized that he's abusive because he kicked the chair and stuff? I'm not as convinced that, one, that is what they're trying to do in this movie. And we'll talk about who directs it. And two, audiences will walk away with a clear sense of, okay, this is what bad behavior looks like. This is what a healthy relationship should look like. I think the part of the problem with the way that this film tries to engage with firstly, no one is forcing anyone to make a movie about this stuff, right? Like, they've chosen to make a film about domestic violence, generational trauma in multiple different contexts, there's multiple different experiences and representations of it. And I think if you're going to do that, you have to think very clearly about, what are you trying to say about this? What are you representing? What are the risks around this? And I'm not convinced they have thought through that. And I think part of the problem with it is this book was written in 2016, before Harvey Weinstein was exposed, before the kind of Me Too movement, which then ushered in a wave of generally like a lot of really interesting and good movies that go to what you were saying, explain that, you know, this myth of the monster is not really how this stuff always manifests, and, you know, what leads people to do certain things, but also the reasons why some victims feel compelled to stay, and just all the kind of complexities and nuances around that. It just doesn't feel like this movie is in dialogue with any of that stuff. It's just telling this story from 2016 that was not really well written, that was criticized at the time for not engaging with things. And I agree with you that, you know, it shows that a hot neurosurgeon can also be abusive, but I'm not convinced that's a problem that needed to be solved. Like, I'm not convinced that most people now are still in that mindset. And I think even when it does show that, I still find it kind of confusing, because I think throughout most of the movie, even if Baldoni's character, Raoul Kincaid, is shown to be a little bit boundary pushing, he's still ultimately shown as being kind of a loving boyfriend. Like, that's why the reveal is so dramatic, right? Because you're led to believe that this is a pretty happy and good and positive relationship. And then, oh my God, turns out he's quite bad. And you live in that space for a short period of time. And very quickly after that, you realize, oh, he's bad because something bad happened to him as a kid. And now he's just trying his best to overcome it. And none of that feels like the reality of this stuff. Like, it almost feels like that undermines what you were suggesting the movie's trying to do, which is explain that all sorts of people can do bad things, and we have to understand that. Not, this guy's perfect, but if it wasn't for this thing that happened to him as a kid, he wouldn't have these anger issues and beat up his wife, and now he's going to figure it out, and now he's going to end up being kind of redeemed by the end of it, I would say.
Yeah, I do think the movie has a structural issue. Like, I agree with you that in a perfect world, for both the movie's sake and kind of social context sake, it would be good to have shown that relationship more in the bad times, and to see what it's like to be stuck in a relationship like that, and kind of, even if she's second guessing herself and enjoys some of it, more of that kind of being trapped feeling, because that is the reality for most of it. That honeymoon period is very short, but in the movie it's very long. And then also, I've heard a lot of criticism about how it doesn't show how difficult it is to leave.
Well, yeah, I mean, you don't see that at all.
You don't see that at all.
You see her in a very horrific situation, and then she's just out.
Yeah, yes. And it's because the characters are so thin as well. I mean, like, who is this woman and where does she get all her money? She's just got this flower business of dyeing flowers.
I looked this up because Meg and I watched this movie together, and we were whispering to each other, like, what is she selling here? Apparently in the book, it's a steampunk florist.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, like, I mean, they're all very good points. I just think, like, and I believe this was some of the criticism, like, initially aimed at the book. It's like, everything that it's trying to do, and, you know, it is definitely a talking point that people need to discuss, that, you know, like what perhaps maybe the stereotypical idea of like a violent relationship is not what most of them look like. And that's important that we all, you know, like discuss and know that. But it always felt like the as far as I'm aware anyway, some of the criticism of the book is that it was trading in like the rom-com territory and really trading off of that in order to like leverage its popularity. But then at the same time, it's like, but it kind of like shoehorns in these other issues. It's like, you know, you're trying to have your cake and eat it too. And I felt the movie did that. It's not that, you know, the moments where they showed how, you know, kind of like confusing or murky those relationships can be, that was done pretty well. But then like, and again, this is where I think I struggle to divorce what I know about the marketing of the film and everything. I'm like, it left a kind of weird taste in my mouth. The press tour has kind of like lined up with the Deadpool thing, and we've got like a Barbenheimer thing. And it's like, it just doesn't feel like tonally they've paid respect, I guess, to the issues they're trying to tell us that they want to really seriously address. And so it all just made me feel a bit funny. And then at the same time, yeah, like I appreciate they do have to show the bits of the relationship that are nice, but it still felt it was like trying to sell a rom-com and then also get buy-in from people who like want to talk about and think about these serious issues.
Yeah, like why are Hassan Minaj and Jenny Slate in this movie?
I think it's to create some fun because otherwise it's just awful, right?
Yeah.
It's like very hokey, cringeworthy romance and then straight up trauma. Like you've got to have something else in the mix. But yeah, I mean, it's telling that even after the book, people, these young readers were describing themselves as like Team Atlas or Team Ryle. Like that's very upsetting, and it's proof that the story is not done well enough because you should not be team domestic abuser.
Totally.
Exactly. Like there are so many Reddit threads that are like, I read one yesterday that's like, hey, like didn't want to admit this, but I actually kind of am Team Ryle. And I'm like, what the fuck? Like this, but that's because I feel like the book and the film consciously like buy into this like stan, you know, kind of culture that we have in order to get buy-in from them, but then they also want the serious side, and it's just, and like, you know, this will probably get, I'm sure if we end up on TikTok with this, there'll be a million teenagers disappointed with me again, but like Colleen Hoover probably isn't the good enough writer to have done this, but she struck gold and then continued to strike gold, and then now we're all kind of here talking about it.
I think there's a wider context as well. Like, you know, this book lives in the shadow of 50 Shades of Grey, which are the kind of romance books that have certain dynamics around, you know, dominant, more aggressive, controlling men. Those books have been criticized as well. But I guess there's a difference between those kinds of dynamics within a BDSM context and conversation and consent and whatever. This book and film are kind of modeling those domineering, aggressive, and violent things without any like of that framework around it, which feels like watered down from something that is already pretty not great. And then by the time it filters down to regular viewers, they're on Reddit being like, I actually thought Ryle was pretty hot. It's pretty cool when, you know, a guy just takes control in the bedroom. That's pretty fun, right?
I mean, the film does end in a place where, you know, are we doing full spoilers?
I think at this stage, fair enough. Yeah.
The film ends in a place where the inspiring thing is she does make a choice for herself. I mean, it shouldn't be a shock with a name like It Ends With Us. That's about domestic violence. Like the inspiring thing for women watching the film is making the decision to leave and actually standing by it. Even if there are these reasons, maybe he's got childhood trauma, maybe he has issues. It doesn't matter because it's your life and what you deserve matters. It does get there. There's you know, there's fudgy stuff around the sides, but it gets there. So does that matter for anything?
Well, I was going to say, I think maybe the elephant in the room around the conversation, and I think this helps pivot to the wider context, because as Thomas said, the movie is ultimately a vehicle for the Blake and Ryan show more than it is a vehicle to really seriously discuss and grapple with these ideas. The elephant in the room is that the bad guy, quote unquote, Ryle, is the director of the movie. And I do wonder if the movie would look and be paced and structured differently, or just the way certain things are shot and the perspectives were shown would be different if the director wasn't the guy who was ultimately the abusive one. And I think that's maybe why so much of the movie does show him just being a handsome, charming hunk.
I'm not so sure about that, because then also he's the guy in the press tour who's actually doing the domestic violence campaigning. Like, he's the only one talking about the issue and everyone else is kind of talking about the rom-com. So, well, you know,
yeah, it's a good point.
He's the guy who came up with the framework for the film, and I have to assume that comes from somewhere. Like, you think that just because he's in the main character role, he wants to launch himself as a Hollywood hunk?
I don't know if it's as straightforward as that. So Blake Lively is a producer of this movie. I think having a star as the producer, the other star as the director, there clearly being some tension that has led to neither of them talking to each other. Blake and most of the other cast, I think everyone except Hasan Minhaj, has unfollowed Justin Baldoni. They're not doing this press tour together. Something clearly happened. There are suggestions that Blake got a friend of Ryan's to do a re-edit of the movie. I don't know if that's actually the edit that was released or not, but it is worth pointing out that Blake Lively, or the young version of a character, is in every single scene of this film. There is no scene of this film where you see Ryle dealing with anything, Atlas dealing with anything that doesn't revolve around
That's
Blake.
actually crazy, isn't
It's
it?
bizarre. It's bizarre. So, yeah, I wonder whether maybe actually we're both maybe right here in a way that, like, he's shooting it in a certain way. Maybe he wants to grapple with these ideas, but he ultimately doesn't want to come across as a super evil guy. But then at the same time, Blake's like, no, this movie needs to be about me. Her and Ryan allegedly buddy up to Colleen Hoover and the distributor Sony and, like, take control and Final Cut. And what we're left with is a really confusing and strange film. Like, that is potentially what's happened here. Or maybe he saw the final cut of the movie and was like, this is dog shit. I don't want anything to do. I'm not going to the premiere. I'm not doing anything. But it's been a crazy drama, right?
Yeah, it's bizarre. Like, I mean, it's already obviously had comparisons to the whole "Don't Worry, Darling" thing. It is very odd, though, to, like, have a press tour for an enormous movie. It's like number 2 at the box office, and not have the two leads who are, you know, like, this relationship is so key to the entire message of the film, just not together. He's also the director of the movie. She's only doing press with other members of the cast. He's doing press completely alone. And it's just like, it's almost, I mean, the very cynical part of me was like, is this some kind of plant? Like, are we being played here? So we do, you know, people like us sit here and talk about it. But I do find it very odd, like, even just to come out with a statement, maybe, like, to say, like, hey, look, we had some creative differences, but, you know, we're all in support of the movie and we hope you enjoy it. Like, hashtag Blooms by Lily or whatever. It just seems really strange. And, you know, there are obviously so many different stories. The one that I was like, have kind of seen the most is that she did a cut, or she actually got someone from Deadpool versus Wolverine to do a cut, which is crazy because that movie is possibly even worse than this one. And then he did a cut and Sony preferred his, but Colleen Hoover preferred hers. So there's like so many weird things going on. And, like, you know, I think to most normal people out of the maybe like social media bubble, that thing of like, oh my God, they all unfollowed it on Instagram seems like probably meaningless and ridiculous, but like that means something in this day and age. So clearly he is on the outer of this like clique. And the funny thing is there is a sequel book, which is inevitably going to be made into a sequel film. And, like, I would not be surprised if he was recast. I feel like basically my social media feed and the internet has been dominated by Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds the last month. It's been very strange to live in. Like, there's so much cross-promotional with these two movies that have nothing to do with each other aside from the fact that their leads are married. And the whole time I've just felt it's a bit jarring.
Well, there's even, like, Blake did a thing on the red carpet where she just chucked out, oh, by the way, Ryan wrote this scene, and there's this balcony scene. I saw that clip before I watched the movie, and I was like, oh, there's like this romantic, funny scene on the balcony. The balcony scene wasn't that good.
It's so bad.
It's so bad. So I don't know if that was her sort of trying to just like ensure that there were headlines about her and Ryan to, you know, force that Barbenheimer narrative that you mentioned, Thomas, or whether she was trying to suggest actually me and Ryan were the creative forces on set here. We were doing rewrites. It's not Justin Baldoni's film.
I also saw the screenwriter respond to that. She was like, that's the first I've heard of that.
Yeah, there is a sequel book, and it does feature all the same characters, so it'll be interesting to see who returns. I was reading the Wikipedia summary of it yesterday. It's seemingly more unhinged than this film.
Yeah.
There's a weird bit where Baldoni's character Ryle Kincaid is watching Finding Nemo, and he has never seen Finding Nemo before, and he discovers his character called Dory, and that is the middle name of the child he and Blake Lively's character have. And then he goes through her diaries and discovers that she watched it for the first time with Atlas, and he has a meltdown.
Well, are you two aware that the majority of the book takes place as essentially diary entries to Ellen DeGeneres?
Are you joking?
Mm-mm.
I only learned that yesterday.
That's why Ellen was in the movie. There's a scene where she was watching Ellen.
Yeah. And I assume why Dory is important to her.
This because Ellen's Dory.
Yes.
This book is sold more.
It
like 7
has
million copies.
layers, you know?
This is
Do
crazy.
you reckon the next movie will be announced and they'll just recast Riles, but it'll be Hugh Jackman? just so they can all three of them hang out forever, annoying everybody.
I mean, honestly, could it be Ryan Reynolds?
Yeah, jeez. Well, Look, Weird Movie, extremely popular, is doing very, very well. A lot of people will watch it. Really glad we talked about it and had that kind of conversation. The other thing that we wanted to discuss on the podcast this week is the return of one of my favorite shows. Thomas, I think it's become one of your favorite shows as well. Meg, I believe it's a show you've seen one episode of since I ambushed you with the fact that we were going to talk about it.
Correct. I watched one episode last night, so I'm ready to go.
It is Industry, HBO show. It airs on Binge in Australia. It comes out Monday every week. Season 3 premiered this week. Thomas, do you want to give us a bit of a rundown of Industry? What's it about? Why do we love it? Before we talk about the return of the show.
Yes. Well, I will quote one of the great minds of our time in that it is the gossip girl of investment banking, essentially, which is a quote that I made up all by myself. But anyway, basically,
last night, everyone.
Basically, look, as you said, season 3 just started, but basically Industry is a show kind of set in the high-stakes world of investment banking, a world that I know nothing about, but I get so hyped by the numbers anyway. And it basically is focused on the sales floor of the fictional financial institution Pierpoint, which I guess is like a Goldman's. It's a private equity firm. And each year they take in a new batch of graduates fresh out of college. And that's kind of where the show picks up. The first season aired in 2020. We meet this batch of graduates and they're basically told from the get-go at the end of, your first 6 months / the end of the first season, only a few of you will be kept on. The entire first season is kind of imbued with this tension of that some of these people will not survive. And basically it kind of then throws us into this high stakes world where they're dealing with, sickening amounts of money every day, but also so much of their role in that industry is about networking and going out and getting to know your clients at a deeper level. There's sex, there is a lot of drugs, there is a lot of relationships blowing up, people falling in and out of love. It really is a show that has it all. I guess the person we follow the most is Harper. She's a young American girl who moves to London, which is where the show is set. And she's kind of a genius, but also the queen of self-sabotage. But she leads this group of young graduates that we follow through from season 1 to season 3, which is where we pick up right now.
Nice one. Thank you. Great breakdown. Meg, the episode that you've watched, is that the pilot of season 1?
It sure was.
Directed by Lena Dunham.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Well, my impression was it's kind of skins meets suits. Does that carry on?
Well, some people, okay, that's so interesting because the first episode of the show, despite all the hype about Lena Dunham directing it, I think is maybe one of the worst. I think the show tonally and performance-wise finds a different groove, and I would call it more Euphoria meets Succession.
Okay, yeah.
Let's say Skins vs. Suits is kind of the B-grade version.
Agree.
Of that.
Yeah. I mean, it was all right. That was my review of the first episode. Did she continue directing?
No,
or just
she jumped off. Yeah. Well, I think what is really interesting about this show, and I think this extends into season 3 as well. We've talked a bit on this podcast about what television kind of used to be versus what television is now, right? And so right now, the kinds of shows that we all love, shows like Succession, shows like The Bear, there are these really complicated, thought through, developed, rich characters who are interacting with the purpose of going somewhere. And these stories, episode by episode or season by season, have these very specific self-contained arcs, and we're kind of being pushed gently towards a direction compared to shows of, yesteryear, which is just here's a bunch of characters. They're going to get stuff thrown at them. They're going to have to handle it. There's going to be new challenges. We don't really know where the show's going, but we kind of seeing these guys hang out, interact. Maybe some of them date. Maybe some of them break up. They get into fights. This feels like a really interesting blend of both of those things. It has a really interesting prestige-y vibe in terms of the writing and the cast and the performances, the sets, the kind of sharp, sleek way the show looks and feels, and the way it grapples with pretty contemporary and interesting political issues. The second season, for example, is set immediately after COVID has stopped, lockdowns and stuff have ended, people coming back to the workplace, a lot of discussion around the financial impact of that, the mental impact of that on people, what that did to the world, as well as people's one-on-one relationships. Season 3 is very firmly set now, debates around wokeness and environmental sustainability and gender equality in finance and people on different sides of those debates. So it's punching at a pretty high range in terms of the themes and the ideas. But then it's also just about a bunch of like kind of young people in their 20s who's smart in their workplace sense, but also kind of dumb because they're young people in their 20s and keep doing coke in the middle of the week and keep sleeping with each other when they probably shouldn't. And I actually love the fact that those two things are melding really well. Like over the last few years, I've come to love these characters, as weird as they all are. And it's like, what will Harper do now? Like, what's Yasmin going to do? What are all these guys up to? And I invested in them as characters, but also love the way that the show's writers use the concept as a vehicle to discuss like contemporary social and political stuff. And I think my initial reaction to the pilot was similar to yours. I was like, this feels like okay, but like maybe a bit mid-tier. I think it just gets better and better and better and better. And I think season 2 is a level up from season 1. And I think season 3 from the premiere that we've seen is a significant level up again. How did you find the premiere of season 3, Thomas?
Yeah, I thought like it is so rare for shows to just keep getting better and better, and probably is a show where you like need to stick with the 3-episode rule. You have to watch at least 3 of the first season to really like get into the world. I thought season 3 premiere was great. The fact that we now have this kind of new character in Kit Harington, it's like a bit of a star power. And yeah, the fact that it is looking at contemporary issues and, you know, this whole like the kind of conscious investor, the clean energy, that being a space that people want to align themselves either because they really want to or they want to appear to be good. It is impressive that they've managed to keep such a finger on the pulse. But then, yeah, at the same time, I'm like, it's fun watching these young hot people do like coke on the weekend and stumble out of the club and then like change their shirt in the company bathroom and be like, I'm good to go, everybody. So yeah, it gets like the mix really right, I think. I still can't shake that there is a sense maybe to have a throwback reference. Has industry kind of Stephen Bradbury its way into the dialogue? A lot of the other shows have fallen off, like Succession is no longer around to compete with. Like this show has been around for a little while and it's always been like close but never quite there. Whereas, as you said, it's now got this primetime HBO slot on the Sunday night, which is historically the slot given to, the most talked about show on the planet. And maybe industry just had to like wait its turn. And luckily this season does seem to be like the best one yet. But I don't know. I don't know if I could ever put it into the Succession tier category, but it's very close.
I think that's a really interesting question. I think what's interesting is that there are different shows that are going in different trajectories. Like we talked the week before about the season 3 problem so many shows have, where clearly some auteur had this great vision to tell a particular story. They executed it in season 1. They got greenlit for season 2. And by season 3, they're kind of like, what are we doing here now? Like this is not what we wanted to do. Whereas this show had the opposite. They had such a big and interesting cast, kind of a lot of unknowns initially. And still a lot of these actors aren't necessarily super famous. And that means you meet them without any sense of expectation. You get to watch them settle into their groove. And I think like the old network shows when there were 25 episodes a year, you love it when I talk about that, Thomas. Over the course of each season and over the course of multiple seasons, the show adapts to like what these characters are good at. What are the interesting dynamics? What if we threw Eric in a room with Harper for a few episodes? What if it's now Yasmin and Eric doing coke in her lawyer's office? Like what does that throw up? And that's a fun place to exist in. I think that's what TV can do at its best. I think that's really different to something like Succession or even The Bear, which isn't about maybe just like chucking characters together and seeing what happens. It's about extremely, extremely tight and sharp writing executed at a very high level by very famous, successful like theatre actors that have been around for 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, and like I said, it is very odd. I guess it is similar to what I experienced in Succession. What we all kind of did is that you find yourself so immersed in these scenes that they're like yelling at each other and the tension is ramping up about something I have no idea what any of it actually means. So like they're like 44 points at 45 million and 3/4, and I'm like, oh my god, they're not going to do it, are they? Like I don't. And then same thing in Succession,
£4.80 a share. That's crazy.
Yeah, exactly. And Succession, they used to do have like similar business chat, and I'd be like, this is insane. They're about to make this decision, not knowing anything that's going on. So yeah, like that, it's quite nice to be sent into a world where you're like, I know it's stressful and I know it's crazy, but I don't know what they do for a job exactly.
I have a question. Why do you think it isn't? Why was this show not popular when it first came out? Why did it never have the cut through moment? It came out in 2020 when we were all in lockdowns, desperate for content. I hadn't watched it. Why is that? Did people not want to watch investment bankers when they were losing their jobs?
It could be that. I mean, it's funny, like, COVID was this time where we had so much to watch, but there's a bunch of shows from that year that I think are some of the best shows that just kind of got lost in the midst of it when people stuck to like rewatching The Office or Friends and things. Like I think about things like Station 11 and Watchmen, some of the literally best TV shows I think of the past decade. I also think like I enjoyed season 1, but I wasn't shouting about it from the rooftops. Like I think you're right to point out that there is like sometimes a suitsy vibe or sometimes a skinsy vibe. For me, it was really season.
Skins is great.
Skins
Let's
is
not
great.
underrate Skins.
Season 2, there was a 2-year break between it because of COVID and stuff. So I think it lost a bit of momentum. And by the time it came back with season 2, which is really, really good, people kind of forgotten about it. And now I think also, let's be honest, like we talked about this earlier, HBO has now just put it in the Sunday slot, and it may be that with Succession, with a couple of other big shows, they just thought, this is good, but it's not our top tier. This is kind of like the second tier show. We're not going to put all of our marketing and stuff behind it while we've got Succession. Now the deck is cleared. This is like a show coming out at a time when there isn't a lot of stuff. And I guess that's your point, Thomas. Is it the Stephen Bradbury of kind of prestige TV? I think in a way it is, but it's also pretty good.
Yeah, that probably won't be a pull quote that Binge uses to like on the landing screen. But even I think the marketing of season 3, like it's been very strange for me because I haven't watched it like as the seasons have dropped. So I've basically watched the first 2 seasons like over the last 2 weeks. So I haven't had that context, but being aware of season 3 coming and the marketing from HBO reminds me heaps of the marketing from Succession. Like suddenly they've got these big like kind of like black and white posters of single characters on like bus stops and stuff. Like they've obviously really hedging their bets on it. So yeah, I mean, I'll be, and I do feel like I've heard a lot of people talking about season 3. So there is like a vacuum there, and I guess this will hopefully fill it.
Well, yeah, I mean, let's talk about like awards, right? It hasn't been nominated for anything. Like it's not an Emmy contender. I think probably drowned out by Succession. I think the only award it's won is a British Royal Television Society Craft and Design Award for casting. But Rotten Tomatoes is an imperfect thing in so many ways. But as an example, I think of the trajectory of the show critically. Season 1, 76%. Season 2, 96%. Third season so far, 100%. So it's a show that it took a little while, I think, to figure it out. But luckily, you've got us, and we're telling you about it now. So you've got it sorted.
It makes a lot of sense to me that Emily in Paris also came out during the pandemic, and everyone was like, this is fucking art. And now we've got Emily in Paris, which drops, I think, tomorrow or today on Netflix season 4. But like that was, I guess, the show people needed at that time, and industry maybe wasn't. Yeah,
it's a good point. Like, what were we looking for at that time? Most people wanted like sort of comfortable, fun, dumb stuff. I was the only weirdo that wanted to watch Station 11, a show set immediately after a global pandemic that destroyed society. I watched Contagion 100 times in a row.
I think a lot of people watch Contagion.
Yeah,
though,
Contagion
like,
was
let's
fun.
see what happens
I think most
here.
people did that for about a week and then they were like, no more.
That's too much. The show has a lot of like anti-heroes. Like most of the people in the show, quite conflicted, quite terrible, betray each other. And what you were saying before, Thomas, about how it represents the finance world, I totally agree. Like I don't understand how most of this stuff operates. I think the show's really smart at not over-explaining. Like there's not a lot of exposition that would just dumb it down and make us feel a bit stupid anyway. But at the same time, you understand why it matters. Like you get the stakes, and when they're throwing numbers out there, you're like, oh shit, this person needs to like win this thing. Otherwise X, Y, and Z will happen. It reminds me a lot of Margin Call, like one of my favorite films where they just don't really tell you what's going on, but you understand what matters.
It's like Succession as well, right? Like how much do you know about mergers and why Waystar shit mattered? You don't, but Kendall seems mad about it. So
Totally. And I still think the 100 was a good idea.
Yes, me
honestly.
too. And then I was like with a friend on the weekend who is in this space. He works for a hedge fund and is in private equity. And I was like, man, you have to watch Industry. And he was like, I don't know. Like he's like, would you watch a show like that, but about like journalism and media?
yeah,
And I
it's the
was like-
bold type.
Well, Meg and I watched one of our favorite scenes from The Newsroom yesterday.
The
Osman.
Newsroom. God, that was a weird show where everyone for like half an hour was like, this is really good. It's not.
No, it was a terrible show. It was a terrible show. I think that's the problem. When you're so close to something, you don't really want to watch it because it's just annoying to point out like how wrong it is about this stuff. All right, before we finish up today, we have our regular Impress Your Friends segment where we share something we watched, read, listened to, otherwise consumed in the world of culture. Meg, you're a wonderful guest this week. You get to go first. What have you got for us?
Mine is somewhat pandemic related, I suppose. So there's a new 4-part docuseries coming out called Chimp Crazy. It's an HBO show which is co-directed by Eric Goode, who was one of the directors of Tiger King. It's following on in a similar kind of trajectory. It looks at the people who own chimpanzees, who keep them as pets in their home. And so it's got very much those eccentric characters that we saw in Tiger King. There's this woman, Tonya Haddix, who's the main character, who looks like a Dolly Parton character. Like, she actively styles herself like Dolly Parton. Her house is all pastel pink. She's got the big blonde hair and she keeps chimps as essentially her children. So it's got this light, frothy vibe, which is kind of silly and zany, but it's also in a way that's slightly different to Tiger King. I think it takes the animal welfare issues a bit more seriously, and there's some scenes in there which are really pretty harrowing, and it follows a lot of work that PETA have done in this space. You know, it looks at women who've kept chimps as their little babies and literally breastfed them at times, but it also, you know, tells the story of that chimp who literally bit a woman's face off, and, you know, how that could be avoided, what needs to be done to avoid those situations. It also features Alan Cumming.
Oh.
So one of the chimps that Tonya owns is a very famous chimp called Tonka. He had a long career in the 90s. He was like the George of the Jungle chimp.
Oh, like he was in George of the Jungle.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow.
He's a famous chimp.
Wow.
And he was in a film with Alan Cumming in the 90s. And since then, Alan's become like a PETA spokesperson. He's kind of realized, you know, we shouldn't have chimps in these movies. It's not fair to them, detrimental for all sorts of reasons. But the docuseries is really, it's super entertaining for all those reasons, but it's also a really compelling object to discuss kind of ethics in documentary filmmaking. So Eric Goode really had to talk his way back into the animal community after Tiger King. It was received really poorly for obvious reasons.
That makes sense.
To the point that he's actually made this show with a proxy director. So the subjects in the series didn't know that he was the director.
They know this is being done by the Tiger King.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and it actively interrogates that. There's scenes with him kind of discussing how he feels about it, and also the twists and turns that the series takes, which are quite entertaining, are also just really, really interesting to think about. You know, what do you owe the subjects of a documentary? What do you owe the audience? How should a director conduct themselves? It's only 4 episodes and it's dropping weekly on Binge, so I think it'll be a real like talkie show. And it starts on this Monday.
Yeah, I've been hearing you get excited about this for the last couple of weeks, and I think it's going to be a big one. I think people will be chatting about this.
I watched all 4 episodes back to back and just lost my mind in the office. So
Yeah. No, I'm excited to watch this, and I think it could be something that we talk about more. Thank you, Meg. Great recommendation.
Praise.
Thomas, what do you got?
Yes. Well, in Mel's absence, I thought someone had to recommend a book. And so I will be taking that mantle today.
Colleen Hoover's sequel to What Ends With Us, It Starts With Us.
Yes, correct. It's big on Book Talk. No, so this is Long Island Compromise by Taffy Brodesser-Akner. It came out a month ago, and I've just kind of gotten through it. It is, I'm not sure if you guys have read her first novel, Fleischman is in Trouble.
Great novel, great TV adaptation.
Exactly. And this feels like it's not a sequel, but it feels like a stylistic sequel. It has much of the same kind of vibe, I guess, as Fleischman. Basically, it's set on Long Island, unsurprising, in the 1980s. Carl Fletcher, he's a prominent local businessman, and basically he's coming home from work one day and he's ambushed on his driveway and kidnapped and tortured, and then eventually weirdly returned to his family. But basically the novel then kind of splits into, it's told by his 3 children in 3 different parts. And I guess weirdly, as is a strange theme of today's podcast, it very much looks at generational trauma, how the kidnapping of their father affected these kids and also affected their father and the family unit. But at the same time, I guess it plays into a similar space to Fleischman, and it's a satirizing or a skewering of the rich. You know, these people have got endless resources and they kind of live in a bubble, and how that community and that family almost tries to downplay the trauma of what happened to Carl. So it's both the commentary on suburbia and, you know, the uber wealthy, as well as a look at how trauma kind of trickles down. It's got the similar thing of, like, you know, Fleischman featured, I guess, a big twist almost, like all that twist energy. There's a lot of that in the book. I really am a big fan of Taffy's writing. She writes for The New Yorker a lot. So if you've ever read any of her stuff or have read Flashman or even watched the TV show, I think you will love Long Island Compromise. That's my recommendation for this week.
Wow, you guys are hitting it out of the park. That's great stuff. Thanks, man. And thanks for keeping the book stuff going.
Yeah, I'm just trying. It's basically a play for me to get the Mel heads on side while she's out, hand, foot, and mouth.
That's really funny. No, the Mel heads transferred very neatly to Meg, and I think whatever Thomas and Oz heads exist also transferred to Meg today.
Yeah.
My recommendation is an artist called Bia Badubi. She's a 24-year-old Filipino-British singer. Been a fan for a while. She's got a new album, was released last week. It's called This Is How Tomorrow Moves. Bia Badubi is like very firmly part of this like Gen Z revival of 90s stuff. She wears her influences on her sleeve. She's talked a lot about loving Mazzy Star, Pavement. I think there's a song she's got named after Stephen Malkmus, The Cardigans. It's a real fun throwback to that sort of sound. A bit of big runga, sway energy on this new album as well. Her last album had a lot of tracks that made me really nostalgic for the era where like Hilary Duff was releasing music, but she's also firmly part of the contemporary pop wave as well. She's toured with Taylor Swift. She understands what people want from contemporary young women pop stars as well. It's a really interesting marriage of those two things. She's a really great person to like read articles and interviews with. She's talked a lot about being an Asian woman growing up in the West and loving pop music, but not seeing herself represented, and then seeing, Karen O on stage and being like, wow, I could do stuff like that as well. She's only 24. She's really, really good. This album is really great. It's a cool entry point into her kind of music if you want to give it a spin. So yeah, that's my rec.
That's a wild combination of influences. I'm keen to check it out.
It's wacky. It's confusing. The Pavement thing, but also like it works. It works in terms of how a lot of the tracks bring these things together, and then sometimes it's like, that's a Mazzy Star track. That's a Pavement
I'm just going to
track.
have Fade Into You playing in my head all day now.
Yeah. Maybe we'll fade out with that one.
Oh, ladies and gentlemen.
Tom, it's great to chat. And Meg, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, guys.
This episode of The Drop was produced by Chi Wong. If you enjoyed listening to today's episode of The Drop, make sure to follow us in your favorite podcast app, leave us a review, or better yet, share the episode with a friend. I'm Osman Faruqi. See you next week.